Well, I will go ahead and kick us off and assume that he will be showing up eventually to talk about his stuff. So, waving my arms for a cut point. If I actually do edit this, hi everybody. Today is Tuesday, April 16th. I'm Aaron of SIGbeard, and you are at the Kubernetes SIG Testing weekly meeting. You're all being publicly recorded, and you can watch yourselves on YouTube later as you adhere to the Kubernetes Code of Conduct by not being jerks. We have two things on today's agenda. First up, Deval wants to talk about a number of things related to job configs. And if Steve shows up, we'll talk a little bit about a prow planning doc that he has been putting together. With that, I will hand it over to Deval.
Hey, so I've given some good updates on the in the notes itself. We have a lot of jobs and config jobs that are handwritten, mostly of handwritten. We have two sets of generated jobs. And during release time, we actually, for some of those jobs, we actually create new job configs for the new release whenever we cut out a new release branch. This amounts to about 100 plus files, which during release time frame, reviewing and generating the pull request is very cumbersome. So about 2 releases ago, we decided to automate this, and we've worked on a plan to make sure we are able to automate this. Recently, we decided to use rotations in the past. So say, okay, let's pick up something from 1.13 and make it as job config for 1.14. That was the task for automating this, but in the last release, we learned that we don't want to do that. We want to get the 1.14 configs from the master branch. And so the strategy we were using earlier was to use regular expressions and replace things safely in handwritten files as much as possible. Now, since we can't do that, we need to identify the configs for master, and master configs are in two different formats. One is where explicitly you define saying this is master, or you'd say that this job is by default for every branch except for these release branches. Those are the ones which have skip branches. So when you have a very detailed pattern of trying to recognize, etc., regular expressions are not a best way to use. So we probably have to load these configs and then figure out which configs are masters, then generate new ones. And the problem with doing that is if you use Go, then Go doesn't have a great YAML support. So when you load and unload, you would have issues with reproducing the same YAMLs. These were handwritten, so they have comments, they have structure, so that cannot be reproduced. And if you use, so if you use Go and then Go YAML and try to load the configs, then you face that problem. And another one is I've also described how we can template this new. How do we determine which configs needs to be pulled automatically from, and how to determine where is the master config and what to do when you don't have master config.
Deval, quick question.
Hey.
What do you feel like the value is of the structure and the comments in those hand generated files?
So I think sometimes the jobs are different, and each job owners put some context and some in comments. So if they add a new option that is beta, alpha, sometimes those comments have those contexts. Sometimes the context they're trying to explain, like skip branches, have had the comment that said, we are skipping these branches because of this. And I remember in 1.11, 1.12, we actually had bad configs. Those configs were fixed in 1.13, 1.14 release timeframe. And all of those those came out when we were doing this particular task, and we looked at the comments, and I spoke to Sen and Amit during that time frame to say, hey, these configs are not doing skip branches properly. So the comments help in context. They add if they are handwritten and they are YAMLs, you get the benefit of adding comments.
I think we can still get a lot of the benefit from comments just by having comments in the places in the config where we specify the template values. I'm not sure that it's necessary for it to actually be piped all the way through to the.
We could also have just like a comment field on the config object that is ignored when it's loaded or something like that. Because I will say, Joel, just as a little bit of background for the deployment for OpenShift of Prow, we run a pre-submit on our config repo that just loads all the config and then dumps it using the GoYAML library. If there's any diff, the developer just regenerates. And then that basically solves all of this. And we haven't, we've been running like this for about a year, and there was worries at the beginning that not having comments and not having manual structure would make things harder to read, but a year later, we don't have any issues with it.
So I want to back up at a high level and say, that sounds like a great description and articulation of pain points and the number of different problems that you are facing. What ask or proposal are you bringing to this high bandwidth conversation? What are you looking for?
So I'm not proposing anything. I have two different options. I think I like templatizing the configs. This was one of the suggestions that came out in the Slack channel that, hey, why don't we create a template for this configs and have a generated YAMLs that are used ultimately. But the problem with templates is, again, you create one template for a config, but those could differ across different versions, different branches. So you need now templates per branch. And then even if you have a comments or a description field that gives those information, comments that says for release 1.14, this is this. And if you reproduce that comment if you use that as a template and regenerate the new version, the release 1.14 string is bad there and it needs to be called release 1.15. This could also apply to flag names, which are not easily definable. So if you have comments, it's very difficult to reproduce them. So one of the ways you could solve this is you create templates and have a generator.yaml that we depend on and leave the handwritten as is and then generate from them.
I mean, how do we, so I'm just trying to figure out how much of this is worth talking about, because I feel like there's a lot of hashing out in a proposal document that is yet to be written about alternatives considered and what you're thinking of doing. So at a high level though, there's this pattern of, we have this really big, easily machine parsable dumb config that are our proud jobs that are a really great map to the pod spec and stuff. And then there's the much more meaningful domain-specific language that you would like to write to describe how you'd like to generate a bunch of jobs from a template. Do we check in generated files, or do we have those generated files magically created on the fly? Today, we live with a pattern where generated files are checked in. Are we okay continuing that pattern?
It would be work updating the config map if it wasn't the case.
Pardon?
It would be more work updating the config map for Prow components in the service cluster if you were generating on the fly.
Okay.
Yeah, I think checking in is good. It has worked for a couple of other similar security jobs and a couple of other jobs.
Okay.
If you already generate.
I think in general, a higher level DSL that generates down into Project YAML is something that we talked about in this meeting about a year ago is one of the best ways to integrate with Prow if you have this problem, and it seems to work fine.
Another question I guess I would have for this group is, do we feel really strongly that Golang has to be used to do this?
You win a lot by using all of the utilities in Prow today. The question of what branch does this target? It's a solved problem that you can just import from Prow.
It brings to mind to me, for example, we have a Python script that munges all of the YAML for test grid config, and it uses a Python library that supports leaving comments and all of that stuff in place.
Yep, and one of the feedbacks multiple times I received on reviews and design doc, which for the previous design implementation we had, was to use Golang, and that's why I brought this up, saying that, okay, Golang has these issues. Python is another option. I have not experienced a failure with reproducing the handwritten YAMLs as the same, but from the documentation of the YAML library that Python is using to generate the generated jobs and the fixed test grid script that you just mentioned, those are using that library, and I've not seen a problem with them. However, they generate a separate YAML file from the configs, so it's not exactly the same thing.
I'd kind of like us to move on to the PROW document. Do you feel like you've gotten enough high bandwidth questions answered that you can move forward and iterate, and we can have something to review going forward?
Yes, I can create a document with a proposal, and then we'll get comments from everyone here.
Okay.
Thanks.
Awesome. Okay, Steve, you wrote a document about PROW. Would you like to walk us through that?
Sure thing. I'm going to attempt to share my screen. Actually, I've forgotten how to do that.
I can share if that would help.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Give me a second.
So yeah, background, I guess, like I think we have a lot of big ideas floating around as to directions that the PROW project can move. And, you know, maybe feature sets or improvements that developers are asking of us. I put together a doc where I put down some of the things that I'm excited about personally. There is a little, like a tiny little template in there. I would love it for people to put in things that they're excited about, like the sort of target for these items are things that might take like a couple months and a couple people a couple months. So sort of big picture ideas of like things that you'd like to see the PROW move to. So yeah, these are just like some of the ideas I had, just a little proposal. Very interested in seeing what everyone else is thinking. I'll do a quick run through of the ones that I've put in here. The first one is to enable open management of the prow.case.io deployment of PROW. So that is sort of like the reference deployment of PROW, and it's definitely the most highly visible one. And so I think we would benefit a huge amount if members of this SIG, if they feel like being included in the on-call rotation, could be. And so there's a lot of work currently being done by the Kubernetes Infra Working Group to see if we can move the infrastructure on which that PROW deployment runs into CNCF-owned space. And so I'm not saying this hasn't been done yet or anything, but like this is something that I think would be super cool for us to hopefully achieve in 2019. And to get there, I think we need to start defining what are the requirements to actually share access control between people across companies. What are the prerequisites for people that want to be on the on-call rotation? What are their duties? What's expected of them? You know, what time zones are we looking for? Like that sort of thing. One of the other things that I'm personally pretty excited about, using quote-unquote best practices for some of the CRDs and API machinery in the way that we interact with Kubernetes API server. So I think PROW is super highly visible as a project that runs controllers and has a bunch of microservices, but I think we have a long way to go between where we are today and sort of the best practices for how those other SIGs expect us to be touching the API server. So here's a couple things that I think we could try to iterate on this year. This next one, ensuring seamless self-service for ProcConfig. So one of the things that I think is becoming like obvious as a critical prerequisite to actually having a high bandwidth PROW cluster is having self-service config for everyone that's using it. And so I think there's a couple gaps here still for a vanilla PROW deployment that make updating your own config, a little bit hard or a little bit esoteric. And so, you know, from a job triggering UI in the web that helps people push the buttons and start their own jobs to maybe better sharding for other types of configuration, locally testing jobs before they're actually pushed up for review, or potentially even rehearsing the jobs in the target cluster that they would be in after they merge. A lot of these sort of tiny gaps make the process of adding your own jobs today pretty hard. And the last one that I put down here is providing metrics, alerting, and some sort of SRE playbook style thing for an administrator who's running a cloud deployment. So I think today we have, I don't know, 20 microservices, and they've all got interesting and like interconnected failure modes. There are metrics on a lot of them. There's not always like, you know, the full suite of metrics that you might expect. We don't really have like a central place that we've written down Prometheus queries that might be interesting once you actually collect the metrics, or alert manager rules to fire off of those. And when there are specific failure modes that happen often and we don't really have control over, those aren't super well documented. So an admin who's looking at failure logs may be surprised to note that Tide, you know, can't post statuses, but in reality, that's, you know, kind of something that happens every week, so it's not really a big deal. So these are some of the epics that I've got. I guess in the time that we have, I'm happy to hear some feedback on them, but in general, I guess this is more just a call for people to put their own information in here. I think as a SIG later, once we have a couple more ideas in here, we can start thinking about some sort of prioritization or determining where we think our focus is best spent.
Personally, like just off the top of my head, this last one to me seems really, really similar to the very first one up top about enabling the community to manage PROW. I would want to give them a playbook and a set of recipes to successfully manage PROW. So just like we have a reference deployment of PROW, I feel like a reference set of best practices on how to manage that deployment of PROW would be really useful. And I personally am trying to push in the K8s working group to understand what is preventing us from creating a PROW cluster in there today, or like this quarter, and understand what the migration path looks like. And I think a lot of the requirements and prerequisites are similar issues that the K8s working group has dealt with or is dealing with when it comes to a consistent set of IAM policies and what it is that we expect as we vet people to help maintain this infrastructure, what level of commitment we expect from people, things of that nature. So I feel like there's a good amount of overlap there. If I have time during tomorrow's K8s meeting, if you want to show up and talk about this there, we could do that. Or, I mean, that's the direction that has the most overlap for me personally. I would aspire to trying to break this work down into issues in the test info repo that we could chunk up by milestone. I don't know if folks like the use of milestones to sort of call out this quarter, next quarter, and later from a planning perspective, but that's a pattern I have seen other SIGs work through. Most recently, a lot of SIG cluster lifecycle projects seem to go through that. But beyond that, I haven't had time to review this stuff super in depth. So I'm also curious to hear what other folks' perspectives are, because as always, I struggle with the balance of I want the right stuff to happen. I want to reduce the amount of friction necessary for that to happen, but it's also really useful to be able to like call our shots before we take them. And for people who show up and want to help out, give them a list of like, here's what is most important to help out on, and it's broken down so it can be worked on. I'm gonna stop sharing so we can see each other's faces, but that's all I had.
Yeah, totally. I think getting a little bit more ideas and visions from other people, I think would be a good first step. And then once we feel like we've got sort of a critical mass of ideas in the doc, we should schedule some breakout sessions to actually think about which of those we want to focus on, and then start making some issues or some actual deliverables.
Steve, what type of, did you say in the doc what type of time frame you are looking for these epics? Is it just kind of like a backlog of things we want to do eventually, or is it kind of like targeting, you know, the next release or the next year or something?
Yeah, I think like nominally the doc says 2019, but some
Okay.
of them are fairly large, and they're generally just things that I think would be cool or I think would be exciting.
Right. Yeah. Thanks for putting this together. I think that's cool, and I want to add some. I haven't had a chance to add anything yet, and hopefully everybody else gets a chance to too, because I think this will be super useful to help us prioritize and coordinate.
I can't tell if the lack of response is a lack of interest or not having had time to engage with this. To me, if I look at this and I overlap it with what Deval was just talking about, it to me it looks an awful lot like trying to document what it is we do around here. And I'm most interested in the parts that describe what is the work necessary for the continued healthy function of the Kubernetes project and its CI. Both around what makes it easier to deal with the toil and burden of managing the sundry jobs, as well as all of the infrastructure that runs and manages those jobs and all of the display of the results. And how can we do that in the most self-service manner possible? Like, for example, we live in a world today where self-service of job configs is very, very possible, except that we also have a pre-submit that makes sure if you have a proud job in our repo, you must also have a test grid dashboard. And while jobs are sharded up by a bunch of other files, test grid is not. And so approval of those is still not very self-service because it often involves pinging myself or Michelle or anybody who happens to be at the root. So that's something I didn't explicitly see in that doc, and I will work to add that. But like, I'm trying to think in terms of that direction. I really like the concept of self-service. And like reducing the toil of job configs has been often discussed. It's usually discussed in the lens of like, we should make proud config easier. And then we talk about domain-specific languages, or we talk about inverting it. So what if we had the config files live in the different repos or whatever? Now I'm just rambling.
I think one thing that potentially we could mention, and maybe there's some feedback. So I think I had brought up at some point, like the idea of when a developer proposes a new proud job in a PR to test it for, or to whatever config repo, having some mechanism by which any proud jobs any proud job configurations that they've edited or added would have like a canary run at the time that they're proposing the change as a pre-submit, so that they can get feedback on whether or not, does every config map that they reference actually exist in the cluster, like that sort of thing. And so I think Eric and I were talking about this, and it seems like a feature that is extremely useful. For the OpenShift deployment, we've got like a DSL version of that. But for Proud.K8s.io, I guess the open question is whether or not the security model would allow it or not. Since that basically gives organization members or people that have OK to test just sort of a blank check to the deployment cluster. And so I think maybe thinking through like the security posture of Proud.K8s.io would be super useful to see like how many of the things that I've written down actually make any sense or not. And can we provide developers like something else instead that might be 80% as useful?
So from my perspective, in terms of next steps, I think I'm going to be out at some sort of summit next week. I don't know if I can guarantee that I will be around for this meeting at this time next week. How would we feel about like 2 weeks from today reviewing like everything that is in a milestone that corresponds to a milestone called 115, and that lays out like everything we think we can accomplish here, and see if how much of that we can tie back to things described in this doc. And then I could take a crack at populating a milestone for what we think we would do for the quarter after. like the thing that concerns me here is I have done this pattern before. And me project managing or attempting to pseudo project manage or impose any kind of structure against people who are not interested in it doesn't do any of us any favors. So I feel like whatever it is that we do to sort of plan and describe our work is something where we need buy-in from everybody involved, not just the 3 SIG leads who've been doing a lot of talking. And so I'm super open to input here or offline on like how we could do better there. Because I'm not interested in wasting my time like shuffling a bunch of things around if that's not meaningful to everybody else.
Yeah, and I think hopefully if we get sort of everyone's opinions on the doc and what they think the next step should be, we can figure out like together what we feel is most urgent or like what we could benefit from the most at the beginning. And if we get that consensus on like prioritization, it might be easier to be more effective at PM.
Suspect we will also be more on track with getting our objectives done if we're not too ambitious about what we're trying to get done, because I find there's just always a gazillion other things that are important to do that need to be done in the moment. If we have something more attainable, we'll probably be better at sticking to that.
Yeah.
One of the things we've been looking at within the conformance working group is doing some automation on the boards, and we've been trying to write a or finish up some prowl plugins to within the ticket, being able to do queries to populate the board itself, and that's coming along, and it might be interesting. I know there's mention about doing milestones as a time thing of when we can get stuff done. The one other approach we have taken is making very small milestones that pretty much look like features that have a bunch of tickets inside of them. So that's a milestone of if we've accomplished doing this thing, and then using something like tags or boards to say when we hope we get it done. But that allows you to move that group of that feature set, forward in a release. So I guess.
Right. It is selfishly really, really helpful for me to bucket things into a quarterly basis, and that is for 2 reasons. One, because Kubernetes releases go out every quarter, and so it helps me understand if there's something that needs to be done to assist with the release going out the door, let's put it in a milestone named after that release. 2, I work for a company that thinks quarterly, so it's really helpful for me from a planning perspective to have those timelines line up.
I think we can also use labels in most anyways. We would use a milestone too, right?
Yes. So yeah, I'm open to any and all options that make this stuff easier to keep track of. Like if I were to go and look at the 114 milestone right now in the test info repo, I would probably be very sad because I'm not sure how much of that stuff actually happened or got done. And it'd be nice not to repeat that exercise this time. And on that wonderful, motivating note, we're about to lose our room and I'm out of time. So I wish you all a happy Tuesday, and we will see you all next week or 2 weeks from now. We'll find out later.
There you go.
Thanks, everyone.